Welcome to the Early Bird Podcast with Andrew Garrison. My name is Andrew Garrison. This is a show where we talk about sports in the state of Indiana. It is a very eventful day to be a fan of sports in the state of Indiana. We have a lot to talk about today. Last night, Notre Dame lost in the national championship game to Ohio State 34-23. We're going to talk about that first, and then we're going to get into the Colts. They have hired a new defensive coordinator. He comes from the Bengals. His name is Lou Anarumo. We're going to talk about the Pacers. Aaron Nesmith is back. The Pacers are continuing to roll. We'll talk about Purdue. They picked up a big win over the weekend. And we're going to recircle to the Lions-Commanders game. We sort of half previewed that game last week. That video blew up, got a lot of views. But what was really blew up and got a lot of views was the game. And the Commanders, of course, did indeed upset the Detroit Lions in the divisional round of the NFL playoffs. So we're going to talk about that game. We're going to talk about that for the Commanders, talk about that for the Lions at the end of the show. But, of course, we got to talk about all of Indiana first, and that's going to start with Notre Dame. Notre Dame lost to Ohio State 34-23 in the national championship game, and it was honestly much worse than that at many points. It was 31-7 in favor of Ohio State at one point. That was, of course, at halftime. And this game to me really showed that there's levels to sports and there's levels to college football, and I just don't think Notre Dame was fully ready for this spotlight, partially because of injuries, partially because of just the setbacks from throughout the year. Across the board, Ohio State's roster was simply better than Notre Dame's. They spent millions on it and with NIL collectives and things of that nature. Despite setbacks, Ohio State won it all. No matter what, whoever was going to win this game was going to have overcome either the loss to Northern Illinois or the loss to Michigan. Ohio State, with 2 losses, wins the national championship. They do it over Notre Dame in the final game last night. Will Howard went 17 for 21 for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. Quinshon Judkins had 100 yards himself on the ground. Ohio State scored a touchdown on every first half drive. They scored a touchdown on their first 4 drives, and of course ends with a tally of 34 points. And that really leads into my first point. Now, when we previewed this game last week, we talked about a few things that I felt like Notre Dame could do to potentially lead them to victory. The number one thing there was keeping the scoring down. I called it accepting the gambit, right? If you look recently throughout the season, who were the teams that got the closest to beating Ohio State? Well, Oregon beat them, and they did let Ohio State score 31. That's an anomaly. Michigan kept that game at 13-10. Michigan ended up winning. Texas had a chance to win. They had the ball down 7 in or around the red zone, 21-14, right? So they keep Ohio State to 21, and of course Jack Sawyer has that return that makes it 28. But Ohio State, low-scoring game against Texas. That was their closest game of the playoff, and low-scoring game against Michigan. That was their major killer loss, or at least their only loss to a team that they were not able to avenge. And Notre Dame just couldn't contain the Buckeyes, right? Notre Dame zips down, scores 7-0, and really the question to me across the board was you're looking at Riley Leonard and saying, how many more times are we going to ask him to do this? How many more times are we going to look at Riley Leonard and say, okay, you've got to march down the field that same way with that same amount of effectiveness again and again? If he only had to do it 3 or 4 times to win, maybe he does. But Ohio State ended with 34 points. That's effectively the equivalent of 5 touchdowns. You're asking Riley Leonard to go down the field and do that 4 to 6 times, right? Could be turnovers, anything like that. You're asking him to do it 4, 5, 6 times against this Ohio State defense, and that just wasn't going to be possible. Again, in part because of injuries, in part because of the gap in roster talent, right? Notre Dame just would not have been able to win a shootout, so they needed to keep the scoring down, and they just couldn't do that. And we saw that in the first half, and that, to me, immediately indicates that the game's over. I mean, it doesn't take anyone with any level of intelligence to know that 31-7 at halftime is probably indicative of the idea that the game is indeed over. But that fact alone, the fact that Notre Dame couldn't contain Ohio State, was enough to tell the world that Notre Dame was not going to be able to win a shootout, because if it was going to be a shootout, Notre Dame was always going to lose this game. The second point, though, and if Ohio State's offense was going to be churning and if it was going to be high octane, the second aspect of this is whether or not Notre Dame can just win the turnover battle and have a few chance plays and potentially put themselves in a position late in the fourth quarter to end up winning the game. And they kind of did that. It was just too little too late. What we wanted to see was mistakes out of Will Howard, because this is a real fascinating test for this Notre Dame defense, right? Because the secondary has been dominant all year long, and that defense really had been dominant all year long. And you look at this secondary for Notre Dame, who, again, They've been locking down quarterbacks, locking down receivers, taking away their options, forcing mistakes. The pass rush gets to the quarterback, and then they're going to have no one to throw to. And if you keep making that happen play after play after play, they're bound to throw a couple of interceptions. And that is half of what really led to Notre Dame being one of the best teams in the country in terms of taking the ball away and, of course, protecting it themselves. But they haven't yet played a quarterback to the level of Will Howard, right? Drew Aller was prone to making mistakes like the interception that he threw that effectively ended the game. But I talked about this in the preview. Will Howard was not going to do that. Will Howard was not going to hand the game away like Drew Aller would, like a backup quarterback at Georgia would, Curtis Rourke, and going back through Notre Dame's entire schedule. They were going to have to force mistakes out of the quarterback. That's how they got here, was forcing mistakes out of Drew Aller, right? Specifically, Drew Aller in the semifinal game. Tie ball game late in the fourth quarter, force a mistake, interception, so that you can kick the game-winning field goal instead of Penn State. They've been forcing mistakes out of quarterbacks, and that's been a major part of how they've been winning. They just hadn't, again, played a quarterback like Will Howard yet, and he ended up being too much for the Irish. Again, 17 for 21 for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. And most importantly, 0 interceptions, 0 fumbles. Will Howard was perfect. Emeka Egbuka fumbled in the fourth quarter, and that set up Notre Dame's opportunity to potentially make a 2-score deficit, a 1-score deficit, and make some shenanigans happen from there. Obviously, they could not convert that into a victory, as you may expect. But again, Notre Dame was going to need to force turnovers to win because Ohio State is just the superior team, right? Ohio State has a superior roster, offense athletically much better than the defense, right? Especially with the injuries Notre Dame has seen. And because of that gap in talent, raw talent, and ability and skill, things of those nature, Notre Dame was going to have to turn the ball over, and that was going to have to come with Will Howard throwing interceptions, in my opinion, most specifically, and Notre Dame picking off some of those passes, and they just weren't able to do that. Howard was not picked off once. He made very great decisions. Possibly there's a 14-point swing of a play to keep Notre Dame in it when Emeka Egbuka fumbled, but again, Will Howard was triumphant. 17 for 21, 231 yards, 2 touchdowns. He did not make the mistakes that you would expect a quarterback maybe somewhere else on Notre Dame's schedule to make. And again, this Notre Dame defense could not force the mistakes out of Will Howard that they could for Drew Aller and other quarterbacks on the schedule. That was a major part of Notre Dame winning games, and unfortunately, it wasn't a factor for them winning this one because they didn't win, in part because they failed in this category. But maybe that's just totally fine, right? Maybe Ohio State has one turnover and it's just a stray play in the fourth quarter that more or less arguably is garbage time. Maybe the other quarterback on the other side can win the game for Notre Dame offensively, and that comes with Riley Leonard on the ground. Because, again, this defense is incredible, and we knew that about Notre Dame. But what we knew about the offense was Riley Leonard and his ability to pose 2 threats on the field, right? A dual-threat quarterback in Riley Leonard. He can throw and he can run. And Riley Leonard in this game was going to have to pose both threats. We saw that against Georgia most specifically, right? In that Georgia game, Riley Leonard, he could run and he could throw. He led the team in rushing on much fewer carries than this game against Georgia. Riley Leonard was fantastic on the ground against Georgia, and that's really a large part in how they were able to win that game, at least on the offensive side of the ball, was, again, Riley Leonard, naturally, as the quarterback, he's going to be a threat throwing the ball. If you're a defense, you have to keep that in mind. And if you kept that in mind a little bit too much, like Georgia sometimes did, Riley Leonard was going to make you punish you with the ground game. But Riley Leonard in this game had 17 carries for only 2.4 yards per carry. He was largely on pace with Howard through the air, although it took many more attempts to catch up to his effectiveness. And he really couldn't establish a true dual threat presence across the board, right? Riley Leonard, more or less, him not being effective on the ground really took away a lot of the threat that this offense has posed against teams throughout their regular season schedule and teams, of course, in the playoff. So Notre Dame, with Riley Leonard not able to really be effective on the ground, that effectively told Ohio State that them just throwing the ball is all that they really need to worry about. And of course, props to the run defense for containing Riley Leonard. But that really took a lot of pressure off the defense, and therefore it was much more difficult for Notre Dame to move the ball down the field and score. Aside from, of course, that first drive where Riley Leonard really excelled on the ground and really excelled on offense in general. So again, looking back across the entire game, right away, number one point is Ohio State was scoring. And because Ohio State was scoring drive after drive and touchdowns drive after drive, we knew Notre Dame wasn't going to be able to keep up with that. They had to keep the scoring down. They had to make it a defensive game the way Texas did, the way Michigan did. One of those teams was successful. Maybe Notre Dame could be successful too. But again, Ohio State just broke the doors wide open and were touchdown, touchdown, touchdown. And there was just nothing, at least it felt like, there was just nothing that Notre Dame was necessarily going to be able to do about that. On the other side of the ball, they couldn't force mistakes out of Will Howard, right? He's just a better quarterback than they faced all year long. We didn't quite know if he was going to be too much for Notre Dame. It turns out that he was. He didn't make the mistakes that maybe were necessary for Notre Dame to turn the ball over a couple more times and win the game. And then Riley Leonard on the ground on offense, right? If Notre Dame was ever going to catch up, they were going to need a dual threat presence from their quarterback. And unfortunately, this Ohio State defense just thwarted Riley Leonard's run presence. And that, again, is part of why Notre Dame was unable to come away with this win in this game. Across the board, phenomenal game, phenomenal moment for Notre Dame, right? Roller coaster of emotions for Ohio State. They lose to Michigan, and then they just start their death march to glory where they decimate Tennessee, they decimate Oregon, and they find their way here in the national championship game against Notre Dame, and they win. So weird season for Ohio State. They won the national championship, but they didn't do everything that they maybe set out to do. And of course, the Michigan loss is what I'm speaking on there. On the other side, we know that there's going to be a bright future ahead for Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. They've reached the title game and really a new era for the Fighting Irish, right? Marcus Freeman has fully set in there. They've made the playoff. They've made a playoff run. They've made the national championship game. Even with a loss to Northern Illinois, Notre Dame did almost everything that they would have appreciated doing right at the end of the season, besides, of course, win the big one. But the 12-team playoff era is here, and as long as the rules stay as they are, Notre Dame is going to be in perfect position to have home playoff games every single year and have more opportunities every single year to put together playoff runs like this one, and maybe eventually Marcus Freeman, as he gains some more resources, it's the era of the NIL and the transfer portal, maybe Marcus Freeman with more resources and a better draw in the national championship, perhaps, and more chaos around him, Marcus Freeman can set himself up for an opportunity to take Notre Dame to the promised land once again. Time will tell on Notre Dame and whether or not they can actually get over the hump and win it all. But again, they weren't ready, right? Ohio State had the superior roster. Ohio State was the superior team, superior program. Notre Dame is working up to that point still. Ohio State, it's taken them some time to work themselves up to this point, right? Obviously, they've been there. They're a blue blood program. They've been here forever. But they've lost to Michigan 4 times in a row, right? Ohio State, it's taken them a minute to work themselves back up to this level where they could actually get over the hump and win it. They were a field goal away from doing it a few years ago. They lost in the semifinals to Georgia. And now they finally get over the hump. They beat Notre Dame. They win the national championship. Notre Dame, they'll get there. They're not there yet, and we just outlined the reasons why there was the gap, right? The reasons why Ohio State primarily was able to beat Notre Dame. Notre Dame will get there. A bright future is ahead for Marcus Freeman, and I'm very excited to watch it all play out. Okay, let's talk about the Colts. Let's stay with football. We haven't talked about the Colts in, honestly, a long time. It makes sense. We've had the Pacers, Purdue, and IU basketball, and Notre Dame football all playing. That really just takes out the 4 segments there. So we should be talking about the Colts once a week, basically until the end of time. And then we'll talk about the Colts twice a week once we get to the season, of course, months and months from now. But the Colts, of course, at least to me, are the team I most care about in Indiana. And I imagine most people most care about the Colts. So we're going to talk about them once a week moving forward. But for now, I want to talk about the hiring of Lou Anarumo. Defensive coordinator from the Bengals is moving to the Colts after being fired in Cincinnati. Let's talk about overall what's going on here, right? We moved on from Gus Bradley after 3 seasons, interviewed 5 possible options. Dennis Allen goes to Chicago to join Ben Johnson, and as a result, the Colts hire Lou Anarumo. So I think we across the board would believe that Dennis Allen would have been the most desirable option. He ends up going to Chicago. Chicago is going to be dangerous from a coach and coordinator perspective, knowing that they have Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen over there. But the Colts grab Lou Anarumo, former Bengals defensive coordinator. He contributed to the Super Bowl appearing playoff run from a few years ago. Remember, the Bengals, they draft Joe Burrow. He gets injured, but then the next year, his second year, but really first as a full-time starter all season, fully healthy, they go to the Super Bowl. They lose to the Rams, but they got to the Super Bowl. They won the AFC, and they had the number 1 defense in the league when they did that under Lou Anarumo. Now, the defense in Cincinnati has experienced a downfall into this season, and people that just off a glance look at the Bengals and say, oh, well, we're taking a bottom half defensive coordinator, Gus Bradley, and replacing him with another bottom half defensive coordinator, Lou Anarumo. Yeah, that statistically is true when you look at 2024 in a vacuum, but Lou Anarumo as a whole, I think, is fantastic. I think this is a great hire, and I think that the personnel declines, right? The Bengals having to make decisions about where they're going to keep which players are going to keep, right? Which salary cap space are they going to allocate to the offense and the defense? They focused on the offense, let the defense kind of fall by the wayside from a roster perspective because they just didn't have the money to pay everybody. And Lou Anarumo really had to do more with less and didn't for most of the year. But as the Bengals rounded into form at the end of the season and really put together a push for the playoffs, the defense was a major part of that. They allowed 18.8 points per game in their final 5 games of this past season, nearly turning the team around and qualifying them for the playoffs. And maybe they beat the Bills, and maybe Lou Anarumo is not even on the market because he's a head coach somewhere, right? In my opinion, this is a steal that the Colts grabbed with Lou Anarumo. The main things for me that I see from him from a schematic perspective are the fact that he doesn't really have a favorite scheme on defense, particularly in the pass coverage. His philosophy is that you should be adapting your defense and you should be adapting your pass coverage concepts, right, to the quarterback that you're facing. This is a league of quarterbacks, right? In 2025, this is a league of quarterbacks. It has been for a while. Some of these elite, just look at the conference championship games, right? Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, all fantastic, young, talented quarterbacks. If you are going to get to the conference championship game, if you're going to get to the Super Bowl, you're going to have to circumvent some of these games against quarterbacks that are just more talented than anyone else on the field. These young, talented, athletic, intelligent quarterbacks, that is what you have to beat. That's what you have to take away. That's what you have to counteract if you're a defense. And Anarumo really takes that to heart and says, depending on the skill set and really just the skill set of the quarterback that we're facing, that's going to dictate how we run our defense. And that's the main difference between Anarumo and Bradley. Bradley ran very static defenses. The Colts were known for playing the most country cover 3 in the league, and country cover 3, really just cover 3. Country just kind of is what indicates that it's regular cover 3, but cover 3, right? What you've seen from the Colts, we play what? I don't even know what the number is, but I'm just going to throw out 60% just as a guess. I have no idea if that's true, but I'm sure cover 3 is what the Colts put on the field defensively the vast majority of the time, and it has its strengths, but it's one of the easier defenses to dissect, and that's what you're seeing with guys like Bo Nix and Drew Lock that are able to just annihilate this defense through the air, is because cover 3 has weaknesses, and the weaknesses every coverage has weaknesses, right? But the weaknesses of cover 3 remain the weaknesses of cover 3 no matter what, right? If you put cover 3 on the field 10 times, eventually any NFL caliber quarterback is going to figure out where the weaknesses are because it's a very straightforward coverage. It works in small doses, but just throwing cover 3 on the field every single play is going to set you up for failure. And I think that really contributed as well to the decline for the Colts later in the season, because when you have even guys like Drew Lock on the Giants or Bo Nix, a rookie quarterback in the Broncos, even those guys that maybe aren't as experienced at reading defenses, they can just watch film from the last 14, 13, 12 weeks, whatever it is, look at all of the cover 3 and just really have an understanding of the tells and the differences. Because again, Gus Bradley, and it wasn't just cover 3. It's not like that's all he played. Certainly, I'm sure it wasn't even more than 50%. I really don't know what I'm talking about. However, Gus Bradley, we know, ran very static defenses, and that's much easier to beat if you're a young quarterback or any quarterback on the other side. Anyone at the NFL level is going to be able to understand how to beat a static defense, and that's exactly what teams started to do and quarterbacks started to do as the season sort of progressed and we got closer and closer to playoff time as the Colts fell further and further off the rails. But Anarumo, on the other hand, is known to be dynamic. He's called the mad scientist by players and plenty of people. He deals with the most effective quarterbacks in the league by adapting his defense, the scheme, the concepts, the coverages. He adapts to cater to their strengths and weaknesses. There's no identical looks week to week. So let's just say if the Colts were in the AFC Championship game right now, if they were playing against the Chiefs on the road, Patrick Mahomes could look at all of the film and sure, he had some understanding of what the basic structure of the Colts defense is, but he still would have to know in the back of his head that Anarumo is going to throw something at him that specifically catered to what Patrick Mahomes struggles to sort of contend with and also maybe could succeed against, and Anarumo maybe would navigate situations like that differently. So he doesn't have a favorite defensive scheme, which is great to see because that's a direct switch up from what Bradley was as a defensive coordinator. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. My one concern is that is a major shift in philosophy. I personally think it's a step in the right direction. However, you're looking at these players, a lot of them are younger, and we're likely going to have to be bringing in guys from the draft or free agency, and you're putting together a secondary, you're putting together a defense that is not at all used to having to adapt this much from week to week. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe there's a slow start for the defense. Maybe it's a full year-long slow start, and Anarumo has to really put in place his philosophy and put in place what he believes is going to work. And then maybe the Colts will be able to acclimate to that and then become one of the better defenses in the league, one of the better pass defenses in the league moving forward in a few years. So we may have to be patient with Anarumo, knowing how he runs defenses and knowing that it may be more of a marathon rather than a sprint to putting this defense in tip-top shape. So we may have to be patient, and that's something that I want to sort of watch and look out for when we get to week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 next season is maybe the defense is having some weak spots, maybe the defense is having some problems, but it's Anarumo's first year with a very complicated system, really a system that doesn't exist, right? We'll see how long it takes for Anarumo to fully put in place the defense and the quality of defense that he wants to have in place. So moving forward, what do we need to do, right? The Colts absolutely need to bolster the quality of the secondary. We need more pieces back there at the second level. We've got to give Anarumo the tools to harbor success in ways Cincinnati sort of couldn't anymore, right? I have no idea how Anarumo was fired at Cincinnati. I think that was a mistake. That's, again, partially why I think this is a steal for Indianapolis. But Cincinnati had some great roster talent back there when they were going to the Super Bowl, and then they unfortunately had to let some of those guys go, and they parted ways in different ways. But if the Colts can give Anarumo what he needs to succeed, the Colts, I think, absolutely could have success on defense as early as year 1 or year 2. So what does that mean? To me, that means we need another corner and another safety. I want this secondary to be fully taken care of, and I think we can do that very easily by grabbing a high-quality cornerback off of the market in free agency and drafting a safety. So Malachi Starks is sitting right there in the first round from Georgia, right? And I know that the Colts could go some different directions. I know Tyler Warren is available. I haven't fully delved into some mock drafts, but first round, second round, I think the Colts need to grab a safety. And after that happens, or at any point when that happens, I think then a corner getting picked away from another team from free agency, I think is what is going to be necessary for the Colts to feel great about their secondary going into next season. Marshawn Lattimore is a target for me off the Commanders, right? Of course, the Commanders certainly have plenty of players that are coveted at this point as they qualify for the NFC Championship game. But I want Marshawn Lattimore and I want Malachi Starks, or some combination of a corner in free agency, safety in the draft, or maybe the other way around. I don't know. We need a piece at both of those positions, and that would make me feel great about the Colts. And, of course, we can kind of reload with some depth the rest of the position group so that if things don't pan out one way or another, there's certainly a backup option maybe or somewhere else they could go with it. So I want to bolster the quality of the secondary. Again, safety in the draft, corner and free agency. I want to give Anarumo the tools he needs to succeed because it may take him some time to work himself to that point where he is having consistent success. So in summary, right, Lou Anarumo comes from Cincinnati. He's got a high ceiling. He's a mad scientist. His complex systems are going to take some time to acclimate to, most likely. But Cincinnati had the best defense in the NFL on the way to the Super Bowl, and if Anarumo can build this defense to that point where they're one of the best in the league, while we build Anthony Richardson to be one of the better young quarterbacks in the league, and he can do crazy stuff like C.J. Stroud and C.J. Stroud and Jaden Daniels have been doing recently. Let's lift up Anthony Richardson. Let's lift up the defense. I think the offensive talent is largely okay. And then you have an AFC South champion, and then you have a team that can win playoff games, and then you have a team that can potentially make a playoff run and go far in the postseason. Anarumo is going to need some more pieces to achieve the desirable levels of success, but to me, this is a steal. This is a fantastic hire, and I cannot wait to see where the Colts go from here with Lou Anarumo as their defensive coordinator. Okay, great time to be a Colts fan, absolutely. Conversely, let's talk about the Pacers. Aaron Nesmith is back, and the Pacers picked up a pair of wins over the weekend. It was a great weekend for the state of Indiana, right? They went to Detroit on Thursday. They hosted Philadelphia on Saturday. I want to talk about both games. Again, they went to Detroit on Thursday. They won 111-100. Miles Turner took over in that game. He went 8 for 11 from 3. He totaled 28 points by the end of it. Detroit turned the ball over 19 times, and Aaron Nesmith returned. He put up 9 points in 9 minutes. He started while Benedict Mathurin was suspended for bumping into the official in that Cavaliers game from just about a week ago. So Nesmith started. He had 9 points in 9 minutes. Then he came back. He came out, right? They're kind of easing him back in, load management as he returns from a multiple month-long injury. And then the bench sort of shared the load when he came out, right? We saw Obi Toppin get some minutes, Jarris Walker, TJ McConnell. The bench shared the load while Nesmith came out. And then again, Philadelphia, this is where Nesmith really popped, right? Philly was missing Joel Embiid, Paul George, Kyle Lowry. They're missing 5 key players. Those 3 star players were out as well. Of course, we know Jared McCain is out for the year. So this is not the Philadelphia 76ers team that we would expect them to be coming into the season, but it's the Philadelphia 76ers team that we've been used to seeing throughout the year. Mathurin came back. Him and Nesmith both played, and really this team's depth was exemplified, all right? Nesmith returned, and I want to talk about Aaron Nesmith in these 2 games and Aaron Nesmith across the board in just a second here. But again, Mathurin and Nesmith were back for the game against Philadelphia, and that's where it felt like the depth was truly exemplified because the Pacers are returning to full strength. They're becoming more healthy by the day, and they're becoming more healthy by the week. And Mathurin and Nesmith both playing really, to me, set that feeling in where it felt like whatever 5 the Pacers were putting on the floor, I had full confidence in their ability to have success. One of those guys is Aaron Nesmith. So he was very, very effective against the 76ers. He finally returns to the lineup after he's been out for months with injury. He started in the wake of Mathurin against Detroit. Again, 9 points, 9 minutes, just swift, get in the game to start things off and then get back in the groove, come out. He about did exactly what we'd want him to do in that moment. And then he popped at home against Philly, had 12 points in the first half, came off the bench for 12 points. So again, Mathurin comes back into the lineup. He starts. Nesmith comes off the bench, scores 12, disappears for the rest of the game. But again, Aaron Nesmith had a massive impact on that game against the 76ers very early on. They won by 13. Nesmith, again, had 12 off the bench in the first half. So one question to me is how they're going to use Mathurin and Nesmith together, because they're both clearly, especially as Nesmith eases back into playing basketball at this high of a level after the injury, they have different skill sets, right? Nesmith is largely a backcourt guy. Mathurin is largely a front court guy, but they both are clearly players that can start. And this is going to open up a lot of doors for the Pacers, where depending on who they're playing, they can sort of cater their personnel on the floor to the success, the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing team, right? The Cavaliers, they needed Benedict Mathurin, right? They needed a guy like him, where the Cavaliers have 2 bigs and they have 2 effective guards, and they have a 5th starter or 5th player. Whoever the 5th player on the floor is always is going to have fresh legs and the ability to pop from 3 or get inside. So the Pacers really, because the Cavaliers are good everywhere, wherever they're succeeding on that day, on that night, you bring in Aaron Nesmith, you bring in Benedict Mathurin, you bring in Obi Toppin. There's plenty of players on this team that have the capability of starting and have the capability of playing effectively when starting or in the game at all. And that's what we're seeing from the Pacers, and it's really being felt now with Nesmith back, Mathurin back, Nembhard back, Tyrese Halliburton was healthy, Turner was there. Everyone was healthy, right? Everyone was healthy. Everyone was present for these games, and they won both of them, albeit against inferior opponents, but still 2 big-time wins to keep this win streak rolling. The Pacers are now 8-1 in the NBA in 2025. So again, this team really does fill the void at every single position when it's fully healthy. When they're fully healthy and playing well, this team can be the best in the league. They can beat anybody. They can win the NBA Finals, in my opinion, if the Pacers are fully healthy, at full strength, and playing well consistently. This team's going to be dangerous in the playoffs, and I want to talk about exactly why here, because, again, this starting experience is really what jumps out to me the most, partially because of the injuries they've had throughout the year, right? Halliburton has missed time. Nembhard missed a lot of time. Nesmith missed a lot of time. We had significant issues at center and in the front court. Bring in Thomas Bryant as a result. We now have, to me, I counted them, 10 players that have played meaningful starting minutes as a Pacer this season. Tyrese Halliburton, Andrew Nembhard, Miles Turner, Benedict Mathurin, and Pascal Siakam all, of course, start typically. But then behind them, Ben Shepherd, he's started games. He's played significant minutes in games. Aaron Nesmith is capable of it. TJ McConnell is capable of it, and he's even capable of taking over games. Thomas Bryant has done it down low. Obi Toppin has done it. Primarily because of injury, which may become a best blessing in disguise, we now have 10 Pacers that can truly take the court, take the floor, and dominate, and they can play effectively. And we've seen that because they've all, again, started games throughout the year when they have to have that next man up mentality and really fill in. So if this team gets to the playoffs, which I imagine they will at this point, if this team gets to the playoffs and if this team gets to the playoffs fully healthy, which we'll cross our fingers for that, you have Halliburton, Nembhard, Turner, Mathurin, Siakam, Shepherd, Nesmith, McConnell, Bryant, Toppin that all have played significant minutes, and no matter who you have on the floor, the Pacers are going to have 5 players that have had starting experience and have had significant minutes throughout the season. And then the second half of that is playoff experience, because the majority of this team is the same as last season. Bennedict Mathurin was out for the playoffs, but most of them were on that playoff team that visited the Eastern Conference Finals last season. A 7-game series against the Bucks, they win it. The same against the Knicks, they win it, and they take a game off the Celtics. Those are 2 tough series. That is no easy path as a 6 seed. Knocked off the 3 seed, knocked off the 2 seed, and then against the 1 seed, put up some amount of a fight as they go on to win the title in the finals just a couple weeks later. So this is a team that most of the players have starting experience, and the significant players, the key players, they have playoff experience from last season, and a lot of it. This is going to be a team, in my opinion, that, again, can be really dangerous in the playoffs. And Nesmith coming back really, I think, exemplified the depth that this team has and how expansively they can distribute the scoring. They can distribute the basketball across the floor. No matter who's in the game, the Pacers have 5 players that can beat anybody in the NBA. Maybe they won't. Maybe they won't actually do it. But to me, I'm interested to see where the Pacers end up being seated. We're 5th in the East right now, just a game or maybe a half a game behind the Bucks for 4th. This is a Pacers team to me that could potentially, again, put another run out there, put another string of wins, put another string of series wins on the floor, and potentially put themselves in a position to win the NBA Finals if they get to that point. I think they can beat anybody if they're fully healthy. I think they can beat anybody if they're fully healthy and playing well. Especially, I'm interested to see if the Pacers actually manage to make that happen for themselves. The playoffs are a far ways away, though. It starts in Paris. It starts against the Spurs, which is quite a switch up. They play the Spurs on Thursday at 2 p.m. on NBA TV in Paris. We'll preview that game on Thursday, which will be a slightly interesting experience. But again, they go to Paris. They're going to play the Spurs. They have a pair of games there. Their first game's in Paris against the Spurs. Then they play the Spurs again in San Antonio just a couple days later. I believe that game is on Sunday. We'll preview both of those on Thursday in full. But they got a pair of games against the Spurs. And the question to me is, when are the Pacers going to lose? Because they are 8-1 in 2025 right now. Their only losses to the Cavaliers, who are the best in the league. They don't play a team that's in the top 6 of the East or the top 6 of the West until February 6th, when they go to LA to take on the Clippers. So for the most part, right, the Pacers don't really play a true quality opponent for a while. Yes, road games are difficult. Yes, the NBA, the talent in the NBA is pretty much scrunched together, right? Any team can really pull off a win anytime, and we've seen the Pacers really put that exact idea into motion this season. But again, they're 8-1 in 2025. They don't play an East or West top 6 team until February 6th. The Pacers may very well put together the best record in 2025 and maintain the best record in 2025 moving forward. They're looking good. The Pacers are looking great, and again, they have some easy opponents coming up. They've got their players back. They've got their core of their team back, and now they can sort of ease them back into NBA level of play against some of these easier opponents, breeze through some wins, warm themselves back up for an opportunity where they have to play another quality opponent. They play the Clippers, they play the Lakers. Both of those games will be difficult, but both of them will be manageable. And again, the Pacers, they have everyone back. They have a team that's capable of beating anybody, and they're going to have some very beatable teams on the schedule until they warm themselves up again for when the schedule gets tough again, and even more so once we get to the playoffs. I think the Pacers absolutely are capable of winning games and of winning in the playoffs and of potentially going to the NBA Finals and winning it because of all the reasons I just outlined. This team has depth, this team has starting experience, this team has playoff experience, and they have the talent capable of running with teams like the Cavaliers and the Celtics and the Knicks, as we've seen all season long. They've beaten all three of those teams at least once. It's a great season for the Pacers. It was a great season last year. It seems to be carrying over into this year despite the slow start, and I cannot wait to see what's next from Indiana because truly I feel that the sky's the limit. Okay, let's talk about Purdue. We're continuing with the basketball conversation. Purdue played Oregon this past weekend, I believe on Saturday. Purdue won 65-58 over the Ducks on the road. That lifts the Boilermakers to number 2 in the Big Ten. They were a game behind 7-0 in conference play at Michigan State. Purdue will travel to Michigan State on February 18th. That's a Tuesday night big-time game. Purdue at Michigan State may very well be the battle for control of the top of the Big Ten. But in this game against Oregon, Trey Coffin-Wren had 23 points and 11 rebounds. Braden Smith had 15 points. He had a great game himself. Cam Heide had 9 points from off the bench. And this was a new test. This was a new challenge for Purdue, right? Because you see Oregon and Washington and USC and UCLA, they all joined the Big Ten. They come in, and for the first time, Purdue, or really any team that was in the original Big Ten, they're going to have to make a West Coast swing where they go to travel and play 2 games on the road on the West Coast. They played Washington and Oregon effectively back-to-back in the span of just 3 or 4 days there. They don't have to do that again this year because USC and UCLA both come to Purdue. However, you go out to Washington, you go out to Oregon. It's the first time they've had a West Coast swing like that against teams in conference, and Purdue was successful, right? Washington and Oregon, again, new to the Big Ten. It's a pair of low-scoring wins for Purdue over both of those former Pac-12 schools. It's a new challenge, and the Boilermakers were successful. And again, this notion that they're nothing without Zach Edey is being disproven every single week as they continue to rack up wins. Partially, it's because of their play down low, maintaining its success. Trey Coffin-Wren is a legitimate force between the blocks, and that I think was absolutely exemplified in this game against Oregon. I said in the preview that the battle of the front court could potentially decide the game, right? That the battle in the front court would be decisive. It's Nate Biddle versus Trey Coffin-Wren, and that's exactly what happened, right? Trey Coffin-Wren had 23 points and 11 rebounds. Biddle had 18 points and 2 rebounds. Biddle cashed in 2 threes, so really it's only 12 points down low. Trey Coffin-Wren held the paint captive all night long. It was really just one big man against another. TKR against Biddle, and yeah, Biddle expanded the floor a little bit, got outside of the three-point line, hit some shots from out there, but TKR really down low controlled the blocks, he controlled the paint, and he controlled the game for the Purdue Boilermakers. He was the anchor, and that's really what I saw as the primary beacon of success for the Boilermakers because they did not shoot well at all, right? Purdue really shot poorly in this game. But Trey Coffin-Wren, and both teams did, by the way, but still, they didn't need to shoot well because Trey Coffin-Wren was so productive down low. Just like Zach Edey. This was a very Zach Edey reminiscent game, and I don't want to just compare Trey Coffin-Wren to the previous big man down there. But Trey Coffin-Wren down low, he controlled the game. He had 23 points. He led the team in scoring, but because everyone else around him wasn't shooting well from around the perimeter and from the field, Trey Coffin-Wren was in there grabbing. Again, he won the rebounding battle between him and Biddle, 11-2. He won the points battle down there, 23-18, really 23-12 when you keep in mind that Biddle had a couple threes. So Trey Coffin-Wren down low, dominated the blocks, dominated the paint, and dominated the game as a result. He's been a fighter all year long. He averages 17.9 points, 6.5 rebounds, and he's 59% from the field as well. Zach Edey is gone, sure, and he's doing great in Memphis, but Trey Coffin-Wren is filling much of that void, and the backcourt has been lethal. Now, it wasn't lethal the other night, right? But you look at Trey Coffin-Wren that's really holding the fort down low, and then you keep in mind that he has a backcourt that's capable of success in their own right. You first look to Braden Smith, right? He takes control of games by the horns. He is absolutely incredible. In this game, he had 15 points, 4 rebounds, 7 assists, and 4 steals. Just 15 points, didn't shoot that well. But Braden Smith, still, 15 is a significant number. I believe it was second on the team, maybe third, top 3 scorer for the Boilermakers. But 4 rebounds, 7 assists, 4 steals is also very productive and very efficient in its own right. He's an influential force, Braden Smith is, right? The ball doesn't just flow through the big man anymore because we saw last year when, again, Smith is still an underclassman, Lawyer's still an underclassman. That Purdue team really flowed the offense through Zach Edey, and that was sort of where the narrative arose that the team was just Zach Edey. Zach Edey's only good because he's tall, and Purdue's only good because they have Zach Edey, who is tall. I disagree with both of those notions, but regardless, Zach Edey's gone now, and Purdue's been totally fine. And it's partially because Trey Coffman-Renn has held the fort down low, but also the ball and offensive possessions don't only flow through the big men anymore. They don't only flow through Trey Coffman-Renn. Sure, they can, but when the ball gets into Braden Smith's hands, you almost know and you can rest assured feeling like that possession is going to be successful. Possessions can, again, flow through Smith, and he can take over games himself. You have one massive superstar player in the front court in Trey Coffman-Renn. You have another superstar player in Braden Smith, and usually at least one other guard is popping, right? Whether Fletcher Loyer is having a great game, or maybe it's CJ Cox, right? Or maybe it's Miles Colvin. All of them have taken over games so far this season. You really have a team, a backcourt, a front court, and an overall roster talent, especially on offense, that's immune to bad nights, immune to nights when they aren't shooting very well, right? Because they didn't shoot well in this game, but for the most part, they just didn't need to, right? They have multiple players that can score. They have multiple players that can carry the team. Again, they shot poorly, but it didn't matter because Trey Coffman-Renn was holding the fort down low. And there's going to be a game where Trey Coffman-Renn just has having an off night. He's not reeling in those rebounds. He's missing some of those bunny shots. Maybe then that's a spot where Braden Smith, Fletcher Loyer, Miles Colvin, CJ Cox, anybody, Caleb First, pick a player, right? Takes over, and maybe the backcourt shines in that game. If the whole team is playing poorly, the team will lose. But that is effectively true for every single team in the country. Purdue's really built to be immune to poor nights because Trey Coffman-Renn is very consistent. He's been the most consistent player on this team. If he happens to be playing poorly, then you have a wide array of guards back there that's going to be able to take over the game. Braden Smith has done it in the past. Purdue takes down number 13 Oregon on the road. They win 7 in a row, and they really just show no signs of slowing down from here. Again, Purdue moving forward, they're going to have some easier games. They're going to have some tough ones. They've got Michigan in a week. We'll preview that game on Thursday. That's another ranked opponent for the Boilermakers. But again, this roster is built in a way where it just makes sense. And I've talked about this in videos past, but Purdue across the board, Braden Smith, he's incredible. Possessions can flow through him. Trey Coffman-Renn, he's incredible. Possessions can flow through him. If either one of them are having an off night, there's someone to pick up the slack most likely. Fletcher Loyer has done it. CJ Cox has done it. Miles Colvin has done it. Cam Heide had 9 points off the bench in this game. This roster is built for success. This roster is built for really effective basketball, especially on offense across the board. And that's great to see because they're doing it even knowing that Zach Edey is no longer a part of the program. Purdue's been playing great to pick up another big-time ranked win on the road all the way out in Oregon on the West Coast. It was very impressive to me, and I'm very excited to see what Purdue does from here because, again, they're on a 7-game win streak and only ascending from this point. All right, that's all I have for Indiana. I want to talk about the NFL, and I want to talk about the NFL playoffs because the Commanders actually did it. The Commanders actually did what I speculated on whether or not they were going to be able to do. Last week, I sort of half previewed this game, the Lions-Commanders divisional round game. I just asked the question and spoke on whether or not, or really what would happen if the Commanders won. What would that mean for Washington? What would that mean for Detroit? And how would Washington what would Washington have to do to actually go out and win that game? To me, the first thing I say is don't look now, right? Everyone hold your horses. Don't look now. But the Washington Commanders are a game away from the Super Bowl, which is an insane comment, an insane sentence. And I personally can't think of a time where I ever even thought about that idea, right? There's teams in the NFL that sometimes I speculate on. I'm like, oh, wonder what it'd be like if the Seahawks got back to the Super Bowl. I think about that often because I miss the Legion of Boom. Think about the Seahawks. What would it be like if they were in the Super Bowl? And you can imagine it. You can see a world with the Seahawks in the Super Bowl. I'm young, I know, but in my lifetime, I have not seen the Commanders or any iteration of their former names in the Super Bowl or even close to it. I've seen them in the playoffs when I was a child, right? But I never really saw the Commanders or this team in Washington achieve a level of success like this. Somehow they're a game away from the Super Bowl, and it doesn't even really feel real, and it especially won't feel real if they actually get to the Super Bowl and have an opportunity to win it. Washington beat Detroit 45-31 in the divisional round of the NFL playoffs on the road at the number 1 seed in the Detroit Lions. They had 5 turnovers. Jared Goff threw 3 interceptions. He fumbled as well. Jameson Williams, they had a trick play. Jameson Williams threw the other interception. So Detroit had 5 turnovers, and I want you to keep that in mind the whole game. Because Detroit scored 31 points despite the fact that they turned over the ball 5 times. Very high-scoring game. It was electric. And what stuck out the most, partially because the team won, but what stuck out the most was that Jaden Daniels is truly the generational talent of this draft class, right? We thought it was going to be Caleb Williams. Maybe it will be, but Jaden Daniels is the true standout generational talent that we hoped we would see from this past draft. He was 22 for 31 in this game for 299 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 turnovers, which is the most important statistic because, again, Daniels had 0 turnovers and Goff had 4. Daniels played like a veteran, all right? That's what sticks out to me right away. Jaden Daniels played like a veteran in this game against a veteran quarterback in Jared Goff for the Detroit Lions. He was lethal. He was effective. He was an unrelenting force, stealthily attacking the Lions secondary at every single turn. It felt like every play, every drive, Jaden Daniels was going to have an answer for the team. He was going to have an answer for the offense. When Detroit faced them with a problem or faced them with an obstacle, Jaden Daniels circumvented them all. Lethal, effective, unrelenting, 22 for 31 for 299 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The Lions had turnover issues in a way that the Commanders just didn't. They also have been very injured, right? Jared Goff threw 3 interceptions. He lost a fumble as well. At the end of the day, that was the end of the game. That's all you really needed to see was 5 turnovers to none, really, at the end of the day. 4 turnovers to none in terms of the quarterbacks. Goff made mistakes that you really don't anticipate seeing from a veteran, not just a veteran quarterback, but a veteran quarterback that had been to a Super Bowl. Remember, the Rams went to the Super Bowl. They lost 13-3 to the Patriots. Jared Goff was the quarterback at that time in some of his earlier years, right? So turnover problems in this game really sold it. I think if Jared Goff is a little bit more composed, I think if he throws the ball a little bit more conservatively, and I know this isn't the identity of the Lions, I know this isn't how Dan Campbell operates, but if the Lions were a little bit more conservative with the football on offense, maybe they come out with a win in this game. They don't give Washington as many opportunities to score. They score more times themselves. But Detroit was also poisoned by injuries all year, and that's why almost any shortcoming in this game doesn't quite hold the same weight to me in my head because I keep in mind the fact that, again, the Lions were poisoned by injuries this season. Yes, it was a meltdown for the ages in this game. They should not have lost, don't get me wrong. But the secondary was extra vulnerable due to injury, and that was something that was fully taken advantage of perfectly by Jaden Daniels. But again, the secondary was injured, very injured. It was decimated truly by injury, and that made it much easier on Jaden Daniels. Detroit, to me, was never going to circumvent this amount of injury. I made a whole video about it a couple weeks ago. I basically just said before the playoffs, I said after they, but before they played the Vikings. So after week 17, I said, it's not Detroit's year. After that game against the 49ers in primetime, I said, it's not Detroit's year. They're so injured, I don't think they'll be capable of winning the Super Bowl. I didn't necessarily think that they were going to lose this game against the Commanders, but I certainly didn't think that they were going to be able to get past this one and then win 2 more games against 2 of the best teams in the league. Maybe they would get to the Super Bowl, but they were not going to be able to win it. The injuries this season piled up, and we knew that way before this point in the season, and I guess it just finally set in that the Lions were not going to be able to win the Super Bowl or even get close, knowing just how, again, poisoned they were by injuries. And then you have a turnover issue in this game. You end the game with 5 turnovers. Sure, you score 31 points anyway, but 5 turnovers with a team that's injured is never going to be able to make up for the success that this Commanders team put up. It was a great game from the Commanders. It was a really bad game from the Lions. That's a recipe for disaster for Detroit, especially knowing that, again, their roster hasn't been at full strength all year, practically. The Commanders managed to win this game, and to me, DC can rest happy, right? The season is complete. If you're a Washington Commanders fan, you must be feeling euphoric, but you must be feeling totally fine, right? It doesn't matter what happens. If you lose to the Eagles, that's fine. You made it to the NFC Championship game. You haven't done this. I don't know how long it's been, honestly, but Washington, at least in my lifetime, has not reached this level of success. They have a new young quarterback. It's an inexpensive roster. They upset the 1 seed. They hang 45 on them. These are new, fantastic heights that never, ever would have been even thought of being seen before if you were a Commanders fan. They dropped 45 on the 1 seed. That alone would knock out a Commanders fan in the preseason if you told them that information. You guys must have no idea what to feel. I would have no idea what to feel if the Colts just pulled this off out of nowhere next season. And the craziest part is, it's not even over yet. Right? The Commanders still have a Super Bowl to play for. They still have an NFC Championship to play for. They're still in contention to win it all, right? This game next week against the Eagles may require a full preview. They returned to Philadelphia for round 3. Washington won most recently. Both teams won at home. Again, this next game will obviously be back in Philadelphia for the NFC Championship game. The Commanders are a game away from the Super Bowl. They absolutely could just go out and make the Super Bowl, maybe go out and win it, right? The sky's the limit for Washington at this point. They're 2 wins away from a championship. They're 1 game away from playing for it. They split against Philadelphia. It's a divisional opponent. Both teams know each other very well. Maybe not as much because Jaden Daniels is new and the Eagles have had to adapt to him. Again, the Commanders won just a couple weeks ago, about a month or 2 ago, a month and a half, against the Eagles in Washington. But both teams have won at home. The Eagles are at home for the NFC Championship game. That game might require a full preview. We might have to just preview both games on Thursday when we get to that point for the NFC and AFC Championship. But either way, no matter how, again, the Commanders could lose by 45 next week. But they beat the Lions. They knocked out the Lions. They've made it this far to the NFC Championship game as a 6th seed, as a true wild card team. And the Commanders, to me, have opened up their Super Bowl window. You have a young quarterback in Jaden Daniels, and because he's on his rookie contract for the next few years, next 3, maybe 4, but more than likely they're gonna try to rework a different deal, right? Young quarterback in Jaden Daniels. That means that he's not being paid very much because he's on his rookie contract. So you have a supporting cast that you can spend money on, right? The rest of this roster talent you can really lift up, and you don't need to do much more lifting up because, again, the Commanders made it to the NFC Championship game this season. So if they make moves in the offseason, they have the capital, they have the resources for the next few years to lift up Jaden Daniels and support him as best as possible so that the Commanders could potentially reload and try to make a run at the Super Bowl or the NFC Championship. Again, you have, a young quarterback, a supporting cast that you have the resources to spend on, and all the momentum the world possibly could offer a football team. And that right there is a perfect recipe to find success in the future. The Commanders, to me, are one of those teams that has an open Super Bowl window because, again, that recipe, young quarterback, a supporting cast they can spend money on, and all the momentum in the world is exactly what you want to see for a young team like this. We saw the Bills achieve a similar level of success. They haven't gotten over the hump yet. Maybe they will this year, right? There's been teams. The Texans maybe are a good example. They were injured throughout the year like the Lions were. They couldn't get over the hump this past round of the postseason. But either way, Washington's Super Bowl window is open. They've had an incredible season. It's complete. They can rest happy. But maybe, just maybe, the Washington Commanders decide to go ahead and win a Super Bowl this season, and that very well could happen. They're only 2 wins away from achieving that. It starts this weekend against the Eagles in the NFC Championship game. We will preview that game on Thursday, and I cannot wait to watch it all play out. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening to the Early Bird Podcast with Andrew Garrison. Again, Notre Dame, they just played in a national championship game. The Colts hired a defensive coordinator. The Pacers are rolling. Purdue is playing well. We did not talk about IU basketball today. I apologize for that. Really, just what happened was the Colts hired the defensive coordinator, and I consider that to be the second most notable news for this episode. So that, of course, took precedent. The Colts in that situation took precedent over IU basketball. They picked up a win over Ohio State. They won in overtime. It was great. It was fantastic. It was thrilling. We'll talk about, I don't know when we'll talk about IU basketball next, to be honest. Probably Thursday, so we could just check in on them. Not sure exactly what we'll talk about. We'll really just update, I suppose, the team at that point. But yeah, IU basketball, they are figuring it out. They, of course, got blown out by Illinois. You can watch the video about that last week. Narrow win over Ohio State on national television, and now they're moving forward into the rest of the season with some opportunities to pick up some more conference wins, hopefully. Either way, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Early Bird Podcast. We will be back on Thursday to talk about a slew of games, right? We'll talk about the Pacers, talk about Purdue. We'll talk about the Colts as well. We got a lot to talk about on Thursday. Notre Dame's done. Football season, that chapter of the Early Bird this year is closed, right? Football season's over. We're going to have a lot to talk about in the offseason for all sorts of teams. But we now move forward into really the bulk of basketball season, and I'm very excited to tackle that really with you all as Purdue preps for the NCAA tournament, IU preps for something, and the Pacers prep for the NBA playoffs. It's going to be a very exciting ride in the state of Indiana and, of course, elsewhere. Very excited to watch it all play it out and talk about it with you all week after week, day after day. Thank you so much for listening to the Early Bird Podcast with Andrew Garrison, and I will see you all again later this week.